Hello? Yes, it's me. I know. I'm sure I need no introduction whatsoever. I'm sorry? Oh, well, if you insist. Welcome to the world of histrionics. Incredible tales from before the now. And yes, it's me, Samuel Pepys, famous 17th century diarist, raconteur, and generally good-looking fellow. Do not adjust your sets. Go and have a lie down if you feel you need it. No need to be subject to the vapours, because my face is on the screen. Oh, yes, my diary was very famous. Do you know, it's over 1 million words long. When I started writing it, Oliver Cromwell had only just died, and nobody was quite sure what to do about the Protectorate. I mentioned having witnessed the death of Charles I when he had lost his head, literally, and we eventually decided to replace Oliver Cromwell with a king, again, King Charles II. And as I worked for the Admiralty at the time, I was on the ship that bore King Charles back to Britain. But you're not here to hear about all of that. No, you want to hear about the Great Fire of London, don't you? Oh yes, Samuel Pepys knows. So, Samuel Pepys will tell you. The fire started on the 2nd of September 1666 on Pudding Lane in the bakery of one Thomas Fariner. Stories say possibly that he left all of the ovens open and a fiery spark landed on the floor and set fire to the building. Remember that the buildings back then in 1666 in London were primarily made of wood. Wattle and daub, which is very dry wood and clay, or some of the bigger wooden buildings had what's called jetties on the top of them. That's upper floors that are bigger than the ones down low. This would make in the older buildings the houses lean into each other, making the streets very, very narrow and wooden houses touch, which rather helps the spread of a fire. Even worse, it had been a very dry year. I don't remember any proper rain since the previous November. So, when the fire started, buildings went up very, very quickly. But we had a fire service. We had people whose job it was to look after the city and look around for spotting fires, namely the trained bands, the militia, the soldiers in the city, although they also, by the way, stored gunpowder either near or in their houses, which is also a bit of a fire risk. Health and safety. Also, of course, the watchmen had to look out for fires and ring bells if they saw one. And very early in the morning, or very late, depending on your disposition, on Sunday, the 2nd of September, 1666, the fire at the bakery in Pudding Lane was spotted. Yes, the train bands and some of the watchmen went out, had a look at the fire. It had consumed 3 whole buildings by this point, forcing Thomas Fariner and his family to jump from the roof of the bakery across the street in order to survive. So the train bands and the soldiers and the men went across and spoke to the Mayor of London, Thomas Bloodworth. They got him out of bed. He went to look at the fire and apparently said, that fire's only very small. A woman could put it out by weeing on it. A woman could put it out by weeing on it? It had consumed 3 buildings. Just what kind of woman does he know? And how much do they drink? Needless to say, he thought his bed and his comfort was more important than a public emergency, and he went back to sleep. And by Sunday morning, the fire was out of control. I remember hearing about it from my servant. I went to the Tower of London and climbed all the way up to one of the great big towers and looked out, and I saw something that greatly disturbed me. London Bridge was on fire. Many of those closely touching buildings were burning fiercely, and even worse, in 1666, there was only one bridge across the Thames, and it was on fire. Now all of the people in the city of London were trapped, essentially. They could get out by the gates in the Roman walls surrounding the city, or by going down to the docks. But there was no easy way out across the bridge. So, Sunday morning, the fire began to spread. By Sunday lunchtime, it was even worse. But even though it was rather large and going across the city at an incredible rate, people didn't believe it would last. They were used to fires breaking out and being put out. So they would walk out of their houses with their belongings and go into a church. And when that got set fire to, they'd go to another one, and then another one, and then another one. By Sunday afternoon, there were some families who had been moved 4 or 5 times. By Sunday evening, it became rather apparent the fire was a lot bigger than any we had encountered before. And by Monday morning, there was absolute devastation. I managed to find Thomas Bloodworth, the so-called Mayor of London, whose job it was to fight the fires, running around and panicking like an old woman. What are we going to do? I said, do what you're supposed to. Make a fire break. You see, back then, The main ways of putting out fires was to fire break, literally pulling down a house that was in the path of the fire. As it moved along the street, you'd remove some of the houses so it can't get to these houses and stops. That's the idea. Thomas Bloodworth told me he had done this, but an inspection later on Monday afternoon by myself and by the king proved that he was totally lying and he hadn't done it at all. He was just running around in circles and crying and panicking, like a great deal of the population were. You see, people were supposed to be putting out the fires by going down to the river and filling them, of course, with water and throwing it on the flames. We also had piped water then in wooden pipes pumped up from the Thames. But the water wheels that controlled the pressure of that water in those pipes had been on London Bridge, and that had burnt in the first few hours of the fire. There was no water, and what's worse, no one to man the water or pull down the houses, as now everybody was panicking and running around those narrow streets I mentioned, getting in each other's way. Some people didn't believe it was going to last, and they were crossing to churches that were already on fire. It was total gridlock, and everyone was panicking while the buildings burned. It got even worse on Tuesday. The fire was so big it started to create its own weather. If the fire set in a very narrow street, the fire, like a chimney, would rush up toward the sky, sucking in all of the air and the oxygen from around it, making the fire even worse. The wind was still quite powerful, and now I became really, really worried about things that were valuable to me. I could no longer observe what was going on. I rushed home, I knocked upon the door, and my wife answered, and I said, "My darling, we must save the most valuable thing we have in the house." She said, "Dear, what a lovely thing to say to me." I said, "Don't be ridiculous. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking about my cheese. We must bury the cheese in the garden immediately, but do it carefully." Carefully. That's a cheese joke. Yes, no, we have to bury it so it wouldn't be melted or explode and destroyed in debris. Debris. That's another. You're right. Yes, never mind. So we buried the cheese and some wine in the garden, and I put my wife and some other books and things that I rather liked on the back of a cart and sent it outside of London. Tuesday was the day of total devastation. It was the day that the fire wreaked the most havoc. A lot of people had thought that the Cathedral, St. Paul's, would be safe. It was made of stone after all. But it was being repaired and surrounded by wooden scaffolding. The scaffolding caught light, and then the lead on the roof melted. Liquid metal ran down the walls and made the stone so hot that the bricks exploded like grenades, and then people began to panic. You see, Thomas Bloodworth was nowhere to be found. He had deserted the city, and the rumour was that the fire had been started by the Dutch and the French, who we were at war with at the time. People started to attack any foreigners they found, and now the watch and the trained bands and soldiers who were supposed to be fighting the fire now had to separate foreigners to stop them being attacked and maybe even killed by the mob. Wednesday, things began to calm. Thankfully, the garrison of the Tower of London had taken matters into their own hands, and without waiting for any word from the King or from the Mayor of London, they had taken their ample supplies of gunpowder and blown up several houses surrounding the tower that belonged to the lawyers' district. This effectively stopped the fire from spreading any further east. The wind also died down on the Wednesday, and the fire began to subdue itself. I remember going north to the park at Moorfields and looking at another city, one made of tents and homeless people, now all living in that park. I walked briefly back toward the city and climbed the steeple of a church and looked out across London and saw the saddest sight of desolation I had ever seen. Small fires were still burning, but the great fire was done. The following Sunday it rained and put out the rest, but the heat... The fire had gotten up to 1,250 degrees centigrade at least. 2 months later, there was coal still burning in some cellars in some houses in the city. 2 months. The grand architect, Christopher Wren, was tasked with planning the new city and maybe designing and building a few new buildings. He also built a monument to the fire of London, placing it very close to Pudding Lane. But there is another monument to the fire, called the Golden Boy, which sits on Pie Corner, the place where the fire supposedly finished. Now, many people blamed the fire, yes, on the Dutch and the French, but many other people said that we were punished by Almighty God for the sin of gluttony, of greed. Because the fire had started on Pudding Lane and finished on Pie Corner. Do I believe that? Possibly. However, it is my opinion that the fire was a disaster that could have been diverted if those people in charge had acted decisively and soon. If Thomas Bloodworth had actually started to put the fire out early on Pudding Lane on the Sunday morning, then maybe the rest of London would not have burned. If he had considered the livelihoods of his people rather than himself, then the disaster may very well have been a completely different story. So, thank you very much for listening to me there, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, do remember to click like, subscribe and share, subscribe and share. Make sure you do that. Subscribe and share and the like and all of that stuff. Thank you very much indeed for watching. My name has been Samuel Pepys, famous diarist. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all. Cheers. I see. That's rather good. What is it, 30? 35? Vimto?